Okay. Um, in this video, we will see how ADO.NET constraints, especially primary key and unique key, works with the data table. We know that database already can provide the data integrity constraints, unique and primary key. So when such functionality exists in the database server itself, why do we need unique and primary key get implemented in the ADO.NET itself? I mean, why we need to implement these two constraints in the ADO.NET? So this is just to avoid the round trip. So for example, user is entering the data from the client application, and there is a unique constraint violation. Let's assume like that. So what happens once he posts the data, or once he tries to save the data from the client application, the data moves from client to server. Then in the server, say for example, if we are using Oracle or SQL Server, the server identifies that there is a constraint violation. Then it raises an exception there. Then that exception is posted back to the client application. Then client responds to that exception in the try catch block. So in order to avoid such a round trip, that is data going from the client to server and server identifying that there is a constraint violation and reporting back to the client, it will be good if the client itself finds that there is a constraint violation and takes immediate action in the client itself. Right. So in this example, we are going to examine the data table behavior in three different ways. So what we are going to do, we will create a data table with constraints. So first we will create the data table without any constraint. Then we will create data table with primary key constraint. Then we will create the data table with unique key constraint and examine the behavior in three situations. First, we will directly edit the data grid view and see how these constraints behave. Then we will try to add row dynamically to a data table. Then we will check how the constraint behaves. Finally, we will merge two data tables and we will examine the behavior of unique and primary key constraint. Okay, so here is the example that we are going to create. In this example, we have three radio buttons. Then we have a load data button. So when user clicks any of this button, then they will click load data. Say for example, user clicks primary key, then they click load data. In this case, we load a data table with primary key constraint. Then we will create a data set and we will hold the data table inside the data set. Then we will assign the data table to this data grid view. So the data grid view displays the data table. So when this data grid displays the data table, we have the option to load the data with unique key, or load the data with primary key, or load data without any constraint. So this is the first option. Then what we are going to do, we will examine the constraint behavior by directly editing the data presented in the data grid view. Then these three controls are used to collect the user input. User provides the input on these three text boxes. Then they will click add row. What happens, whatever entered here will get inserted into the data table and get displayed in the data grid view. Next, user can enter the data on these three. Then they can click these three arrow button so that the data get added to the data table. This way we are dynamically building the data table here. So if I enter data 3 times and click the button 3 times here, then we will be seeing 3 data row on a in-memory data table. After that, we will click this add table button so that the in-memory data table get merged to the data table which is already displayed here. So the clear button is used to refresh the page. Say for example, if I loaded the data with unique constraint, and later if we want to examine the behavior with the primary key constraint, what we have to do, I have to clear so that all the data table, data set and data grid view, everything will get cleared and refreshed. Then we can load a brand new data with a different set of constraint or even without any constraint. So this is all about the example. So we will examine the example and here in this screenshot I haven't provided any control names here. So while we are progressing in the video, we will see what are all the control names when we look at the code. So this is the implementation required. Here I just presented the code only. In the demo you will see that I am building the application from the scratch. So the first what is required is the namespace. So we are using a SQL data namespace. So next we are declaring 2 global instances. One is a title dataset, another one is a DT title. So this dataset we will load a data table from the PUBs database, and then this data table that we are going to build dynamically. So I told that there is a 3 arrow button, right? A button with 3 arrow symbol. So with that we will build a dynamic data table. So this is the global entry for that dynamic data table. So in the clear button handler, first we clear the data grid view. First we are setting the data source to null. Then we are clearing the rows and column. Next, we are clearing the title data set. Why? Because the title data set loads the the title data set will have a data table called titles, which retrieves the data from titles table of the PUBs database that we are going to see soon now. So we are clearing the title data set. We are also clearing our in-memory table, this DT title, that also we clear. Then when we actually load the data, we disable all the radio button controls as well as the load button control. So this is just to avoid when we are already in the experiment mode of loaded data. We don't want to load and collapse our global variables. So what we do when we are loading, we disable all this control. So in the clear, we will enable these controls. That means we will make the control visible. So the load button will get visible, as well as the radio button controls will be visible once the clear button is clicked, so that user can load a new set of data with a different constraint or with a different radio box selection. All right. Finally, we clear the user controls. You saw the text boxes, right? So those we will clear. Also, we will clear the list box item, which will show the in-memory table content. So here is the load button handler. In load button handler, what we do, first we create a data set. So this we saw that it is declared as global. Then we are using a SQL string which takes data from PUBs database. So this is where you have to make change if you don't have PUBs database. You can search, you can Google it to get the PUBs database. Even though now we have the modern SQL servers, the PUBs databases are released by Microsoft during SQL 2000 period. But still you can get the PUBs database in the form of SQL script, and you can still apply it on your modern database. If you find difficulties, then you can create your own table just to examine the example. So that's all here. I am pulling just 3 columns from the titles table of the pubs database. That's our select string. Then we are creating a SQL data adapter, and we are supplying this SQL string as well as the connection information. So this is the connection string that is formed through the application settings. So yeah, once this is created, then it can be used. So in the demo, I will show how we can create a connection string as application settings itself. If you see here, this is the project name, then I'm accessing properties, settings, then I'm taking the pubs connection string, default pubs can. So pubs connection string I'm taking, and I'm creating the SQL data adapter. After that, I'm making call to the fill method of the SQL data adapter, and the fill method will fills the title data set, the data set. And so when we execute the select statement, we will get a row and columns of data. So the fill method actually creates a data table, and it keeps that data table as part of the title data set. So now the title data set will have a data table, which is nothing but the return result of the select query. And the second parameter names the data table as titles. So that's all going on in this 4.1 section. In 4.2, we are actually creating the constraints. First, what we are doing, so the fill method already created a table, and the data table is kept inside the data set. So we are just querying that data table. From title data set, we are accessing the tables collection. Then we are passing the name of the data table, and we are getting the data table. So this titles plays the role here. So now our data table collection has only one entry, which is nothing but the titles data table. So we are taking the title data table and we are storing that in DT title. Next, we are checking the radio box selection. Say for example, if user checked the unique constraint radio box selection here, then we are creating a constraint. So we are using data table DT titles, then we are accessing to constraints collection, and we are making call to add. So here we are adding a constraint. The constraint name is unique one, so that's the first parameter. In second parameter, we are saying which column the constraint belongs to. So I'm using the data table, then I'm using the columns collection, and I'm saying title ID is the column. For that, I want to apply the unique constraint. So first parameter is the constraint name, second parameter is the column, and third parameter is whether it is unique constraint or primary key constraint. I'm passing false, so this is unique constraint. By passing true, it becomes the primary key constraint. Here it's a mistake. I just named this as unique. You should have kept this as primary key. When we are making code change, we will do that correction. Right, so the code snippet 4.2 is for adding the constraint to the data table. It acts based on the radio box selection. So in the previous slide, you saw that there are 3 radio buttons. So RAD unique is the radio button for unique, and RAD P key is for a primary key constraint. So once primary key is checked in, once primary key is selected, then we are adding constraint for primary key. So the third parameter plays the role here to say whether the constraint is unique or primary. So when we load the handler, either we load the data without any constraint, that is none of the radio box is checked, or when unique is checked, we are loading the data table with unique constraint. or if primary key is checked, we are loading the data with primary key constraint. Okay, now data table is ready. Actually, data table is ready in 4.1 itself. In snippet 4.2, we are adding the constraints, and in 4.3, we are setting the data source for our data grid view. So the data grid view, we already know that the left-hand side big pan area. So that's our data grid view that we are using for the display purpose. And we are setting data source to the data table here. So data table, once again, we are retrieving from title data set, and then we are retrieving the data table. So when we are setting the data source this time, here at this time, the data table is loaded with constraint or without constraint based on the radio box selection. Right, this width is just to provide more room for the title. Once the data is displayed, you will know why we are explicitly setting a higher width for the second column. All right. So in the clear button, you saw that we enabled all this control. Here we are disabling all this control. So I am disabling the load data visible property to false. Also, I am hiding these radio buttons. This means once you load the data, you can't load it again without clearing the, without clicking the clear button. So you know the reason why. All right. Okay. So now let's implement and check how this works. Okay. Here is the implement.txt. So I'm not going to type each and every line of the code. So I'll just do a copy paste, so you will come to know in what order we are implementing the coding. So what I'm doing first, I'm taking the sample 01 snippet. So view code. So once the form is created, now I'm adding the namespace system.data.sql client. After that, I'm declaring two global variables. So these two global variables should be part of the class. So yes, so I'm keeping it inside the class definition. Here my class definition starts, so I'm keeping it inside here. Let me save this. So the first thing what we are going to do, we are going to implement the clear button handler. So I'll copy these. So these are all already explained in the slide. So that's all the clear button handler. So these three is the control, title ID, type, and description, and btn load, and all these radio buttons are these controls. This is load button and all these controls. Data grid view is here. This is the data grid view. Right. Now we have everything is ready here. Okay, we will put the load data handler also. Okay, that's all. So what I did, I just included the namespace, then declared these two global variable, then clear button handler is implemented, then load button handler also implemented. Now what we will do, we will save the project, We will rebuild the solution. Okay. Solar succeeded. Now let's examine the behavior of the constraint. So before that, I told that we have a connection string. So I already have the pubs database in my SQL Server, and here I am forming the connection string. So what you have to do, right click and go for properties, then go to settings, application settings, see for dataset primary key constraint, dataset primary key constraint, which is my namespace, then properties, well, because I have chosen properties, then settings, properties, then settings, application settings, then I am choosing the default setting and selecting the pubs connection string. So what I have to do, click on the project, I'm accessing the properties, then settings, application settings, settings. So you can see that order here itself. So I accessed the namespace, then I accessed the properties, then gone to settings. After that, I'm forming the connection string here. So what you have to do, you have to name your connection string. If you are going to use this example, name it as pubs connection string to avoid code changes. Then choose connection string here, choose application, then click here and then click this ellipsis button. So from here you can choose the, you can form the connection string. Say for example, this is data source. Since database is on my local machine, I'm choosing a local host. After that, once I click, I can see all the database. Here I'm choosing pubs database. And that's I'll test the connection. Click OK. So I'm clicking cancel since the connection string is already created. I will undo my change here. All right, I'll save it. So this is how you have to create a connection string. So point to pubs database. If you don't have pubs database, then point to your database and make changes here. That's sufficient enough. And you have to point your connection string here. Now let me run this and we will examine the constraint behavior. I will make this as a full screen. Then let me load the data without any constraint. So the data is loaded from title table of the pubs database. What I'm going to do, I will add a column here, TC1 book-01, then double click here, add a category 1. So now when I click outside the row, what happens, actually here we are trying to add a data row. So the data up to this TC47 is loaded from the database. Then we are dynamically adding the data by directly editing the data table in the data grid view. And once I click the outside row, it tries to commit the data not in the database, inside the data table. So that time we get an error. Here we won't get any error because we loaded the data table without any constraint. So it accepted it. So let me add TC77747, Then let me add book -02, then category 2. So now it allowed the duplicates, right? So let me clear it. So let me break this. We will reload this, and this error may be because of okay, DT title I declared, and it's not yet used. We are going to use it later. Let me comment this, and we'll make this correction as well. So I'll put this as P key. Let me rebuild it, and I'll launch it again. So in the previous launch, you saw that we loaded the data without any constraint, and when we are trying to clear, we got an error. All right, now let us load the data with unique constraint. Note that when I place unique here, when I select the radio button unique, in the data table, we are loading the data with unique constraint. So here we are actually applying the unique constraint to data table. So after loading the data, we are setting the unique constraint. So after this point, if there is any constraint violation, that means if we are adding the data that time, if there is any constraint violation, it will not be allowed. Right. Let me load the data. First, let me add a okay. So I added a entry. Note that we loaded our data table with a unique constraint. So if I click outside, it will allow. Why? Because TC01 is not conflicting with any of the title ID here. So if I click here, it will get accepted. Now let me copy this. Let me try adding this. Okay. Then book 002. After that, I am placing category 02 or category 01. Now what happens if I click outside, it will throw an error. Why? Because it's conflicting with the PC triple line. So let me click here, and I will see that there is a constraint violation, and column title ID is constrained to be unique. Value PC 49 is already present. So this is the error we are getting. This is because we loaded the data table with primary key constraint. In the previous case, it's not the case. It allowed the duplicate. So let me clear and load the data with primary key. So the behavior is same. I can add the normal data without any constraint violation, and it will allow it. Now let me add the data with existing one, TC47, which already exists. Right. So if I click, I will see the similar error. So here the behavior is same because primary as well as unique key constraint doesn't allow the duplicate on the title ID. All right. So let me clear and close this, and we will go back to our slide and proceed with the further examples. Okay, so now let's go to add row functionality. So what we do here, we will enter our title ID, then type, after that description, then we click add row. So in this screenshot, you are seeing that the data is already loaded by means of load button click. And in the previous demo, you already saw how the data is loaded by the radio box actions. So the same exists here. Before coming to this flow, we may already loaded the data with or without constraint. Then here we are entering our data in the text box. Then we are adding the row dynamically. So the only difference is, in the previous case, we directly edited the data. Here we are forming a data row and we are adding it to the grid. So here is the code for add row handler. So what we are doing, first we are getting the data table from the title data set. So the same way that we added our constraint, we are getting the data table. First we are getting the data table. Then we are creating a new row for the data table, because we are going to add a row. So user is not going to edit this data row directly. So they will enter some data here, then they will click add row, and the new row is added with this data. So that's the intent. So from the retrieved data table, the data table is retrieved from data set. Then from that retrieved data table, we are asking to create a new row. Then in the title row, we are referring the column. Remember, these column names are actually part of the select query that we pass it to the adapter.fill method, right? So using that column name, I'm picking the column. Okay, so now title row of title ID represents the title ID column. Then I'm supplying that title ID column with the data which is taken from the text box here. So txt title ID is this one. From there I'm taking the text and assigning it. Similar way, I'm filling the type and the title description, which is title, right? So data row is populated with the data. Then what I'm doing, dt title, we retrieved the data row by making call to the new row. Now what we are saying, we are accessing the rows collection and adding the row which is given by the data table itself. So here it returned a data row without any data. We are populating the data. Then using the same data table dt title, we are accessing the rows collection, and we are making call to the add method. That means the collection will get a new entry, which is nothing but a new data row. After that, what we are saying, dt title as of changes. So in the data table, we are making call to as of changes. So the as of changes will in turn make a call to the refresh method, and the refresh reflect back in the data grid view, and I will be start seeing the new entry. So without this as of changes, you will not see the new entry. So there should be a way to trigger the refresh on the underlying presenter. Here the presenter is the data grid view, because we set data source as the data table. So when we make call to as of changes in the data table, which notifies the data container, which is the data grid view, and asks the data grid view to refresh, stating, hey, my content is changed, you refresh to show the new content. So the newly added row will get displayed. So this is done in the try and catch block, because when we load the data, we may load the data with constraint. So for example, if I loaded a data with a unique constraint and the user is trying to apply a duplicate here, then the catch block will catch that. Right, now we will see the demo of that. Okay, so now we will implement the functionality of adding a new row. So when we are adding the functionality, we have to think that user will first select any of these three radio button, then they will click load data. So the data get loaded into the data grid view with or without any constraint. And the data is entered on this text box. Then once the add row is clicked, the row get added to this data grid view. So all we need is the action here. We have to add code for this add row handler. So I'm just double clicking that. So the add row handler is empty. Let's pick the data for add row handler. Okay, so the code is added. This is already explained in the slide. Let's build and test the new code. Okay, and let me maximize it. So first I will load the data without any constraint. Then let's add the data here. Title ID is TC 100. Type is CAT, category 1, and description is sample book 01. So now when I click add row button, the code that we written will run and it will add the data here. So we remember that we loaded the table without any constraint. So it will even accept the duplicate. So we will put a TC 47. I'll keep the same category and change the book as 2. If I click add row, it accepts the duplicate. Now let's clear and click primary or unique key. So the behavior is same on both the load. So I will show only one. Here I will pick unique key constraint and load the data. Then I will add data without any constraint violation. So it get added. Now let me add data with violation. So here if you see, the title ID is conflicting now. So when I try to add the row dynamically, we will end up in the catch block and we'll get a message. So it says the column title ID is constrained to be unique. Value TC47 is already present. So already present means the sushi anyone book title exists with the title ID TC47, and we are trying to add one more book on the same title ID and it violates the unique constraint. Previously it allowed. Why? Because when we add the row, the data table doesn't have any constraint. Why? Because we loaded the data table without any constraint, but this time we loaded the table with unique constraint. And if you see, this error message is coming from the front end itself. We are not hitting the database. Of course we hit the database when we are loading the data. Once the data is loaded, we are disposing the adapter in the load itself. Then we are trying to add these rows dynamically, and at present the database is disconnected here. Since the constraint is applied at the front end in the data table, the error is coming from the front end itself. So this way we can avoid the round trip, which I explained in the initial portion of this slide. Right, let me click OK, and we'll clear this, and we'll go back to the slide to examine the final portion, which is merging two tables. Okay. So we examined the add row functionality already. So far you may be wondering that I shown and said that there is no difference between primary key and unique key constraint while adding the new data row. So, but there is a difference in the behavior when the data table is loaded with unique key or primary key constraint, and the difference comes into picture when we are merging two data table. So far if you see, we are creating a data table by making call to adapter.fill method, and adapter.fill method queries the database. It returns the data table, and that data table will be part of the data set, Then we usually make call to the dataset to ask, hey, give back the data table, and I will apply the constraint to it. So this is what happening in the load. And in our examination, when we add a new row, we are adding a new row to the data table which is in the data set. So when we are talking about merge, we need two data table. So one data table, we know that it already exists in the data set. It is loaded from the database. Then we are cutting down the database interaction. After the load, we are saying goodbye to the database. Then we are adding the data manually through add row button. Right, now what we will do, we will, to merge, we need two data table. One is source and another one is destination. Here we are going to keep the data table in the data set as the destination. Data source, I mean the source data table, we are going to build in memory. So that's what I am saying here. Merging data table is done in 2 steps. So what we are going to do, we are going to build in-memory table, then merge that in-memory table to the data table which is present in the data set. So what happens when merge happens, unique does not allow duplicates. That means if source table has duplicates, it will not allow. But when the data table in the destination is primary key, then if the source contains the same column name or duplicate column name for the primary key, then based on the duplicate p key column, it merges the source with the destination. Yeah, you will understand that when we are implementing and experimenting it. So far we haven't built the in-memory table. So what we have to do, first we have to go to our load button handler. We know that in load button handler in code snippet 4.1, we are making call to adapter.fill method to create the data table and data set. In code snippet 4.2, we are actually applying the constraint to the data table. And in 3 and 4, we are doing the other stuff, that is setting the data source property of the data grid view, all the stuff. In 4.5, what I am doing, so this is the extra code that we are going to add in the load data set. I mean the load button handler. So we are creating a new data table. So if you remember, this is one of the variable we declared as global. That means the class instance level variable, which is private. Then what we are doing, we are adding columns to this table. So the column is title ID, title, type. If you see, the column name is matching with the data table which presents in the data set filled by the data adapter. So, okay, I am naming the column name as same so that it will allow the merge. Then data type also I want to match with the one, I mean the destination one that already exists in the data set. So that's what I'm doing. I'm referring the data table which presents in the title data set. Then I'm picking the column from the data table. Then I'm choosing the data set. So for title ID, I'm picking the title ID column and I'm giving that data type. I'm doing the same thing for other 2 columns. This way, our in-memory table matches exactly with the destination table that we are going to merge soon. Okay. So after that, there is a btn add data table. So this button is a vertical button with the 3 arrows. So once I click that, what happens, first it takes the user supplied data and it will add that user supplied data into the list box. So this is just to show what are all the in-memory table content that we have built so far. Just for display purpose, to know what are all the column or what are all the row I built so far. So that will get displayed in the list box. Then what I'm doing, on each click, I'm forming a new row from DT table, DT title. This time if you see, I'm creating new row from our in-memory table. In the add row button, I created new row from the data table, which is part of the data set. Here I am creating a new row in the in-memory table, that is the second data table or the source data table that we are going to merge with the destination. So I can say I'm building the source here when I click this button. So using the new row, I am taking the user supplied data, then I'm making a call to the rows collection and adding this new row. Next, once the add table button is clicked, I'm actually going to do a merge. So what I'm doing in the title data set, I am making call to merge method. Then I'm supplying the in-memory data table. So if you see here, two data tables are involved. One is title data set. This is the data set. Then I am calling the merge, and this is the source data table. So what happens, it tries to merge this incoming source data table with the data table already available in the data set. How come the merge happens? Why? Because the DT title is the data table which has the same name as the previous data table. So for example, here I am creating the data table with same name titles. And if you remember, in the adapter.fill method, we have given the data table name as titles. So the title data table already exists in the title data set. Now I'm throwing a in-memory table and asking to merge, and since the table name matches, then this data title will try to merge with the existing one. So here what so once we make call to this merge, the merge had already happened. So here we are making call to accept changes. You know the reason why we are making the call. This is just to refresh the presenter, which is our data grid view. Once this is done, merge already happened. So we no longer need this DT title. So I'm clearing all the in-memory data table rows. Then I'm clearing the text boxes. Then I'm clearing the list box content also. Right. So if there is any exception which is caught during the merge, that is displayed here in the catch block. We are displaying exception message. Then we are doing the same stuff on the exception block also. Right. Now let's go ahead and implement this functionality and examine the behavior. Okay. So first we will build our in-memory table. So that goes into load function handler. So I hate searching it, so I can double click and go to that portion. Okay, it's running. Okay, now our DT title is ready. So yeah. So in the clear button handler, we have to clear this DT title. Remember, I commented it previously. This is already explained. So when we are clicking the load button, we are building, we are creating the in-memory table, but by this time there is no row. It has empty row, but data table is ready at this point. Now So user fills the data here, then they will click the arrow button. So this will add content here for visual purpose or to know the in-memory content, and at the same time it will build the in-memory table. So this is the handler that we have to add. User enters the data on these three, then they click this button to generate the in-memory content. So if I need 3 row in my in-memory table, I will type here, I will click once, then I will type second row, I will click here, I will type third row, I will click here. So we will be having 3 row in the in-memory table, right? So okay, this is the one we have to implement. This is also already explained in the slide. Let's go ahead and implement the last one. Add a table. Okay, now let's examine the merge operation and how it is taking place and what is the role of unique and primary key constraint in terms of table merge. So first we will see how the table merge work. For that I am loading the data without any constraint. Now let me add on data TC 100. Type is category FN01, sample book 1. If you see, my in-memory content has one book. I'm adding one more row. Category is 001. Here I will put 02. Now let me add one duplicate also, TC 777, and book name is 3. So now if you see, my in-memory table contains 3 rows, and in that TC100 is not conflicting with the existing title ID. 101 also not conflicting, but TC777 is conflicting with the existing one. So this is my destination table, which is part of the data set, and this is my source table. Now when I click add table, we are making call to dataset.merge, and we are going to pass the in-memory table, and merge will be done by the dataset. So the data table already named as title here in the dataset. I'm naming this also as title. So when I ask to merge, this content will go and merge with the existing table in the dataset. Now let's see how it works. I'll click add table, and if you see, the data table is merged with the data table in the data set. And if you see, it allowed the constraint violation. Why? Because I loaded the data table without any constraint. Now let me go back and clear this. I will load this with the unique constraint, and I will load the data. I will do the same step. Okay, now I have 3 column. If you see, here itself we have a conflicting data row, And let me put one more conflicting, which is conflicting with the existing TC 777. Now I'll add this also. Now if I click add a table, you will see the constraint violation, and it will show what are all the constraints that get violated. So in my in-memory table itself, there are two conflicting rows. Why? Because I have two TC1000. So here it is TC1000. So when I try to merge, it will show that the constraint is violating. Why? Because TC1000 exists. Even though it doesn't exist in the destination, when I am building the in-memory, I put two duplicate. Now then I kept TC47, which is conflicting with the existing one. So now we end up in the exception block. So let me go ahead and clear it. If you see, it doesn't allow the duplicate when we are merging the data. Now let me load the data with primary key. This time I'll put TC 100 category 01, then sample book -01. So I added that book, then 101, added that. So all three book I added, and this time I am not making any constraint violation. So what I will do, I will clear it, load the data again. This time we will make constraint violation TC 100 category -01 sample book -01. So now I will put any existing data, PC 999 49 category 02, then sample book 04. Then let me add one more book without any conflict. So now if you look at our in-memory table content, TC100, it is not conflicting, 102 not conflicting, PC99 not conflicting, but PC49 is conflicting with the book that already exists here. Now if you remember, we loaded the data as with a primary key. Now if I ask to merge the data table, what happens? The PC9949 already exists here. It merges the content actually. So what happens? It won't say there is a constraint violation, but it takes the content sample book 001 and replaces that with the net etiquette. Then it replaces the type with the new type that is supplied here. So let me go for add table, and you can see that. So it allowed our 3 new content, and the 4th content actually gone and merged here. Sample book 04 and category 02 is merged. If we loaded the table with unique key constraint, then we may be getting an error stating that there is a unique violation. But in terms of primary key, the new incoming data is merged with the existing one. The source data is merged with the destination when there is a match in the title ID, if the data table is loaded as a primary key constraint for this particular column. So that's all on this video. Yeah, goodbye.